and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I hope everyone's doing well. And my name is Michelle Loth, and I'm the Individual Gifts Coordinator here at the Western Environmental Law Center, or WELC. And WELC is a nonprofit public interest environmental law firm, and our mission is to use the power of the law to support thriving, resilient Western U.S. lands, waters, wildlife, and communities in the face of a changing climate. And as a public interest law firm, we do not charge any of our clients or partners for our services, but rely instead on the charitable gifts from good people like you. So your support really does make a lasting difference for all the wildlife and wild places that we love so dearly. So just thank you for taking the time to show up and engage today in all of your busy schedules. Before I jump into things, I do want to just go over a couple Zoom housekeeping notes. Just to minimize any background noise, we do ask that everyone stay muted unless you're asking a question. We just want to preserve that audio quality for the recording. And that being said, the call is being recorded. So if you have to jump off at any point or would like to revisit it, that will be shared with all registrants. So as long as you registered, you'll be receiving a copy of that recording. And if you do have any questions that come up during the call, definitely feel more than welcome to type them in the chat box, and we'll try and circle back to all of those at the end of the call. And then you can also raise your hand at the end of the call, and we can just verbally have a conversation. So whatever works. And then one other note that I'll make is that we do host these calls regularly throughout the year, featuring different WELC staff and board members discussing a variety of topics. So definitely keep your eyes peeled for that. And then also at the end of the call, we'll be raffling off a stainless steel WELC cup just as a small thank you for your time and attending. So I think with that, we can go ahead and jump into it. Today's webinar will feature WELC attorneys Rose Rushing and Morgan O'Grady, who will lead a discussion about the complexities of carbon capture and sequestration technology, otherwise known as CCS. They'll review planned uses for this technology in Montana and New Mexico, including a planned mega project in Northwest New Mexico. Rose and Morgan will provide an update on legislative changes regarding CCS and review Biden-era funding commitments to CCS projects and anticipated changes under the Trump administration. And a bit of background on our speakers today. We have WELC attorney Rose Rushing, pronoun she, her. Rose joined WELC as a staff attorney in 2021. She earned a JD from the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, where she specialized in critical race studies and public interest law and policy. During law school, Rose was president of the Native American Law Students Association and editor-in-chief of the Indigenous Peoples Journal of Law, Culture, and Resistance. After law school, Rose worked at DNA People's Legal Services in Farmington, New Mexico, as the director of the Victims of Crime Act project, providing assistance to victims of domestic violence. And Rose holds a BA in political science from the City University of New York, Hunter College, and she's based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then we also have WELC attorney Morgan O'Grady on the call, pronouns she, her. And Morgan joined WELC as a research attorney in 2021 after earning a JD from Northeastern University School of Law. And while in law school, she interned with Earth Justice, the California Department of Justice, Wild Earth Guardians, and the Charles River Watershed Association. And she holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Wesley College, and Morgan is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Morgan and Rose, and I'll get that PowerPoint brought up, Morgan and Rose, so whenever you're ready.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thanks to everyone for coming today. We're really excited to get to talk to you about this topic. So I'll wait until the slides are up. Thanks, Michelle, for doing that.
Mm-hmm. Can you see that okay?
It looks like it's
Oh,
showing the,
presenter mode,
yeah,
or it's
thank,
not. Oop,
it is showing presenter mode.
okay.
Um,
Oop, 1 second.
and while Michelle's pulling that out, actually, I'll give two quick notes up top. So we're going to be talking about carbon capture and sequestration today, or CCS, but I'll flag up top that we're not going to be talking about naturally occurring sequestration of carbon, such as the planting of trees or preserving of forests. And we're also going to be focusing specifically on the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and CCS.
Sorry for the delay on that.
No worries. All right, that looks great. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Sorry about that. Sounds good. Thank you, Morgan. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. And you can go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. So a quick overview, I want to start us off with some basic terminology. First, carbon capture, use, and storage. This speaks to the process by which emissions are captured from processes that emit greenhouse gases. So think of a natural gas processing facility or a coal-fired power plant or industrial processes. The captured carbon dioxide is then transported, often via pipeline, to a storage site and there it's injected underground. This mitigates but doesn't entirely remove the emissions of projects that would otherwise emit greenhouse gases. And I'll speak more about in a minute about why it doesn't capture all of the emissions. Then we also have carbon dioxide removal. And the most common process of carbon dioxide removal that you may have heard about is direct air capture, which pulls greenhouse gases directly from the atmosphere. Direct air capture, or DAC, is very energy intensive. So while various folks call for it in climate scenarios, it is, because it's so energy intensive, it's not scalable to the rate of emissions that we generate as a society today. Next slide. So CCS alone cannot solve climate change. You may have heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, calling for carbon capture and sequestration in its various pathways to getting to 1.5. But a key piece of context here is that carbon capture and sequestration is one of many technologies that the IPCC references for emissions reductions. And critically, it only makes sense within a phase down of fossil fuels. And the reason for that is that point source capture from emitting sources never reaches 100%. The claimed capture rates are roughly 95% of emissions, but achieved rates have historically been closer to 30 to 80%. So if you put carbon capture technology, for example, on a coal-fired power plant, you're not going to get to a zero emissions scenario. And it's also going to take even more power to run the technology that captures the carbon dioxide. Additionally, carbon capture and sequestration doesn't address upstream leaks, so methane leaks in the oil fields when you're extracting the oil and gas for later consumption. And CCS also doesn't address downstream consumption. So there, think of, for example, in your kitchen when you're burning natural gas to power your gas burner stove as you're cooking your meal. So capture from emitting sources cannot realistically get us to a net or negative emission scenario. And that, coupled with the or the power intensity, the power needs of powering capture technology, is why it is not a tool on its own that can solve climate change. It has to be coupled, if it is used at all, it has to be coupled with a drawdown from fossil fuel use. Next slide. With this, I'll pivot quickly to talking about the ways that the fossil fuel industry benefits from CCS. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but The primary point here is that most of the CO2 that has been captured uh, it historically has gone towards extracting more oil and gas via a technique called enhanced oil recovery. And this is essentially where CO2 is pumped underground to flush more oil and gas out of the ground. Historically, this has been done using mined CO2, so naturally occurring CO2 that is then extracted from underground, piped to oil fields, and put underground to extract more oil and gas. And the oil and gas industry stands to benefit in the long run with more carbon dioxide to send to the oil fields because then they can extract a lot more oil and gas than they would be able to without enhanced oil recovery. Next slide. The other way that the oil and gas industry benefits is via tax credits, which makes these processes marketable or profitable. Tax credits have been very generous to the industry, and the oil and gas industry has also lobbied very aggressively for these tax credits. The tax credits go not just to what is called geologic or long-term storage, although we are still figuring out technologically how much CO2 does remain in the ground when you're pumping a lot of it underground and considering the long periods of time that it's going to be underground. We just haven't been looking at it for hundreds and thousands of years, which is the time span that it would need to be remaining underground for it to have a climate impact. But whether you're looking at that geologic or long-term storage or enhanced oil recovery, you get tax credits for both. And so the oil and gas industry is getting tax incentives for using CO2 to pump underground to extract more oil and gas. Next slide. With that, I'll talk a little bit about some of the CCS projects that we have been keeping an eye on. So there are two projects in the Upper Rockies. One is the Snowy River Project. This is a sequestration site in Montana that would primarily receive CO2 from a gas processing plant in Wyoming called Chute Creek. That processing plant in Wyoming handles natural gas that is really rich in CO2 content. And the implications of that are that the natural gas actually would not be marketable if they could not sell the CO2 that they have to pull out of the gas to make the gas, to send the gas to market. When they pull the CO2 out, they're selling it for enhanced oil recovery. And if they weren't doing that, then the gas, it would just be too expensive and the gas wouldn't be marketable because they wouldn't turn a profit. So the Snowy River sequestration site, it is made more profitable with these tax credit incentives, and it would hold carbon dioxide that otherwise would be sold for EOR. So they'll be trying to sell as much CO2 for EOR as they can. In the past, historically, Chute Creek has vented to the atmosphere any CO2 that they can't sell to the oil fields for enhanced oil recovery. And now that extra CO2 would be put into this injection site in CO2 in Montana. And I'm not going to talk about the harms associated with carbon capture and sequestration today, the harms that communities living around these sites can face. We've talked about that on previous webinars, but we're happy to answer any questions about that at the end. The status of this project is that it was undergoing NEPA review, so environmental review under NEPA, and the project was put on hold pending a decision in the Greater Sage-Grouse Resource Management Plan, since this project directly implicates sage-grouse and sage-grouse habitat. That decision was finalized in January, but it's currently slated for the chopping block under the current, the new presidential administration. And so things are a little bit in flux, and we're waiting to see what happens with the Snowy River project. The second project that we're keeping an eye on is the Moxa project in Wyoming. And this is another sequestration site, planned sequestration site. There's a right-of-way application that is pending with the Bureau of Land Management to store CO2 underground under these public lands. And this, like the Snowy River project, is kind of midway through the NEPA process. And right now, I think the next step is to see the final EA come out, environmental assessment, and from there we'll continue to participate in that project process. With that, I will turn it to Rose to talk about the projects that we're seeing in New Mexico.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and perfect. Thanks, Michelle. So we're also seeing pressure for carbon capture and sequestration development and rollout in New Mexico from both industry as well as lawmakers, as well as some of our universities. I think a big part of this pressure, which is actually also somewhat bipartisan as well, is the connection between CCS technology and enhanced oil recovery, as Morgan talked about previously. So it is billed often as a climate solution, like Morgan says. And at the same time, that carbon is then often extracted from the long-term storage to be used in further oil and gas development. So you can see it would be popular on both sides or perhaps unpopular. But so we're seeing a lot going on in the New Mexico landscape with CCS, including 2 bills in our legislative session that's happening right now. And I'll go over those in a couple slides. But first, we've been tracking this mega project in the Four Corners region of New Mexico for several years at this point. It's called the Four Corners Carbon Storage Hub. This map is based on several years of FOIA and IPRA requests that we've been submitting on behalf of partner groups who are based in the Four Corners region. And the tireless information gleaned by those partner groups, attending meetings, asking questions. In particular, San Juan Citizens Alliance is on this call. Tona Joniane, just want to thank you guys, Unique Care as well, and NEBA. And so this map is sort of zoomed in on the Four Corners region. We have a little map of New Mexico here with like a star in the Four Corners region for any non-locals. And the Four Corners Carbon Storage Hub is a proposed mega project that would tie together all these elements that you can see here on the screen. There are hydrogen production facilities, carbon capture and storage, wells and long-term storage facilities as well. And so the main purpose of this major project is keeping the Four Corners power plant alive, as far as we can tell, which is a coal-fired power plant located in the Four Corners region on the Navajo Nation. It's one of the last remaining coal-fired power plants in the Four Corners region. San Juan Generating Station was finally closed and demolished last year. And so this is that specific application of CCS technology to coal-fired power plants that Morgan was talking about earlier. In terms of who's behind this project, the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, known as New Mexico Tech, has applied for and been awarded $41 million at least in federal funds from the Department of Energy for funding available under previous IRA and BIL programs to undergo site characterization for large-scale carbon sequestration in the San Juan Basin. They applied for this funding and listed partnerships with groups like Tallgrass Energy and Enchant Energy. Enchant Energy in particular had previously attempted to retrofit the San Juan Generating Station, a different coal-fired power plant, with CCS technology and had failed. As far as we can tell, the proposed source of the carbon would be from the Four Corners power plant as retrofitted with this technology, although some of the documents show plans to source carbon from the Escalante power plant in Pruitt, New Mexico, which is currently retired. There's another entity as well, Tech Navajo Transitional Energy Corporation, that's also listed as a partner and has made public statements about taking ownership of the Four Corners power plant and managing the retrofit with CCS technology. And that graph that Morgan had in an earlier slide is kind of a good demonstration. It's like putting a tube on top of the smokestack. It's not literally that, it's much more technologically complicated, but just for the sake of like imagining how a retrofit of a coal-fired power plant might theoretically work, it's along those lines. They capture the carbon coming out of the plant. And therefore the plant is able to continue burning coal to generate electricity. Unfortunately, this technology has never been proven to work at scale, even in the test plants. that this has been attempted on. The project documents that we've received through FOIAs over the years state that this facility intends to store at least 150 million tons of CO2. Under the last administration, under which most of this project was going on under the Biden administration, community benefits plans were required as part of the funding that these entities were receiving from the Department of Energy to build this or to characterize the site testing wells. And that was justified in part by the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, which was an initiative from that administration that 40% of all benefits of climate funds and projects should go to environmental justice communities. We had been working for several years with Four Corner-based groups to intervene in that community benefit process. Just frankly, we're not sure if those offices still exist, if those people still work there. As you guys probably know from reading the news, it's pretty chaotic right now. So we're still kind of trying to figure out if the community benefits part of this program continues to exist. Community groups that we work with have opposed this project because the project would exist almost entirely to perpetuate the continued operation of the Four Corners power plant, which groups oppose on the basis of air pollution caused by operation of the power plant that's experienced mostly and most severely by folks that live near the power plant. It can cause health impacts. It can cause really reduced air quality in the region. I myself lived in Farmington for the last 5 years prior to moving to Albuquerque, and I can attest to the greatly improved air quality since the closure of San Juan Generating Station, and we're super grateful to our Four Corners-based partners for that. As well as other reasons that our partners oppose this project is that the technology to support the carbon capture and sequestration at coal-fired power plants has never been successfully implemented, which basically mitigates the potential for this project to serve as a climate solution. But what this project could continue to do is generate carbon that can be sent down to the Permian Basin, which is on this New Mexico map here, down in the corner for enhanced oil recovery and for more oil and gas development. So even though these projects are often billed as climate solutions, this is a great example of a project that unfortunately absolutely is not. So this is a project that we've been focusing on in New Mexico, and we'll see a lot more small scale enhanced oil recovery stuff throughout the state as well. If you could go to the next slide, Michelle. Thank you so much. So just really quickly, there have been, as I kind of mentioned on the last call or on the last slide, there have been some significant changes under the Trump administration. During the Biden era, there were significant incentives for CCS, including grants for federally funded testing and construction of new projects under the IRA and the BIL, like the project in New Mexico that we just talked about. There were also loans available for CCS development and an increase to existing tax credits, particularly the 45Q tax credit, which was passed originally before the Biden administration, but was updated and increased under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Tax credits are really important in the calculations of this technology being economically viable or profitable. So there's a quote from an article that was just published this week by the executive director of the Carbon Capture Coalition. Without the tax credit, pretty much all of these projects go away. So there's sort of a big open question right now with what's going to happen with the tax credit. So and also, like I said previously, under the Department of Energy during the Biden administration, there were a variety of community benefit and community involvement requirements for funding and approval of any federally funded projects. All the Justice 40 stuff was in an executive order that has now been repealed by the Trump administration, and we haven't had any contact with those offices. We haven't seen any updated guidance from the Trump era Department of Energy, but we're anticipating a rollback of any regulations or requirements that would have required CCS developers to inform community members about local impacts or involve them in the negotiations at all. There's been a lot of speculation about what else will happen under the Trump administration, given CCS's framing as a climate solution. But we know that this is also an oil and gas incentive as well, and is profitable if they can get the tax credit for enhanced oil recovery. So there's currently a push in DC to expand federal tax credits for carbon capture and sequestration, which has some Republican support. Something like 20 House members have signed a public letter, for example, urging the Trump administration not to end the 45Q tax credit. But we all know by reading the news, if you guys can bear to do that in the morning, that Congress needs to make up some money to pay for the multi-billion-dollar tax cut package. And so it's just not clear at this time whether or not the 45Q tax cuts will survive. That's anticipated to have a big impact on the industry. Given the current chaos at the federal level, it's basically impossible to know what will happen. I think a lot will depend on the final congressional budget and whether or not the tax credits survive. So if you want to go to the next slide, Michelle. Thank you so much. Okay, and then I'll go through this quickly because I've been talking. We saw to this effect several legislative initiatives at the state level during the last legislative sessions in both Montana and New Mexico. In Montana, we saw State Bill 81, SB 81, which would have allowed injection on Montana state lands with just a $20,000 bond. The bond is what the injectors or the developers have to pay the state government to theoretically pay for any like cleanups or accidents that occur. We helped our partners, Northern Plains Resource Council and the Montana Environmental Information Center, who both did the critical work lobbying at the Montana State Capitol. And I'm based in New Mexico. I didn't work on this, but I heard wonderful things about the lobbying work that you guys did. So thank you both so much if you're on this call. That bill is now dead and the Montana legislative session is almost over. So it looks like Montana may be out of the woods for this year in terms of increased CCS development. We also saw HB 457 and HB 458 in New Mexico. HB 457 is called the Geologic Dioxide Sequestration Act. It would have given the Oil Conservation Division, which is an administrative agency within the New Mexico Environment Department, or within one of our agencies, authority over CCS projects. It would have required surface owner compensation for surface owners that live on top of where the projected plume would be for the injected carbon. And it would have authorized the agencies to charge the injectors regulatory fees. We had initially objected to this bill because it had no provisions to compensate surface owners in case the underground CO2 migrated. And it also allowed continued drilling through stored CO2, which would increase the risk of leakage, kind of like popping holes in a balloon or something like that. You don't really want to be poking more holes through the stored CO2. That bill died in committee yesterday, so we anticipate that it's dead for now, barring extraordinary measures. There's also HB 458, which would have expanded the Oil Conservation Division's rulemaking power and transferred carbon capture and sequestration liability to the state 5 years after closure. Like Morgan said, these projects are intended to store carbon for like 1,000 years is the timeline on a lot of these project documents. So that means that the state would have had to take over management of the stored carbon, tracking it and cleaning up any accidents after 5 years for the next 1,000 years. There's sort of like an interesting question there. What's the most efficient way to do that? Our state agencies had a different take than we did, but it's something that we anticipate a lot more discussion on. This bill also would establish a 10 cents per metric fee for a stewardship fund for the state and to pay for monitoring and cleanup. We had initially objected to the 10-cent fee. It was locked at 10 cents, but thanks to improvements in the bill, it's possible that that will be amended in rulemaking to go up to adjust for inflation and things like that. It passed a committee, passed its last committee, it's onto the Senate floor, and we're not sure if it'll be able to beat the clock. The New Mexico session ends on Saturday, and they've got a lot to get through, so we're just not sure. We're going to wait and see what happens with that one. But that tees us up for the next state of engagement here, which is, regardless of the bill's passing, possible engagement with the state rulemaking process. So with that, I will pass it back to Morgan. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose. All right, I'll talk a little bit about the regulatory structure and how that fits in with the rulemaking process that Rose was just talking about. So next slide, please, Michelle. So the Safe Drinking Water Act is what regulates these wells. The Safe Drinking Water Act, which is a federal law, it regulates whatever's put into the ground for the purpose of protecting against contamination to drinking water. It is not designed to protect against leaks to the atmosphere, which would reduce any climate benefits of putting CO2 underground. On this graphic, you can see a handful of different classes of wells. Class 2 wells are what we've been talking about for enhanced oil recovery, and that well class has been in place for a long time. That is a mature, not a technology, but it's the class 2 wells have been in use for a long time. However, they deal with much smaller quantities of CO2 and they function a little bit differently. The class 6 wells, you see that on the far right side. Class 6 is a relatively new class of well, maybe a decade or two old, but relatively new compared to the other classes under the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the class 6 wells are what we're talking about for this long-term geologic, as it's called, type of carbon injection. Next slide, please. So the primacy process, what is primacy? Primacy is the process by which a state gains regulatory and enforcement power over a process that would otherwise be handled by the federal government. So before a state gains primacy, the EPA, the federal EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, handles the different classes of wells under the Safe Drinking Water Act, and a state can apply for primacy of a specific class of well. Many states, for example, already have primacy over class 2 wells. What we're now seeing is a lot of states applying for primacy for class 6 wells. And the reason that states want primacy is because the EPA has been reviewing class 6 well applications really slowly, and states that want to push this industry forward, and especially states with a strong oil and gas industry like New Mexico, which the industry is also really pushing for this process to move forward. Those states are now applying for primacy so that they can approve the permits more quickly. New Mexico has started the primacy process, and it will be engaging in a rulemaking under existing authority. Probably in the next year is what we've been hearing from the regulatory agency. And at a state level rulemaking, there is an opportunity for interested parties such as us at WELC, as well as our partners in the Four Corners, to participate in that rulemaking and try to make sure any guardrails we can achieve are in that rulemaking. It's a really big priority of the New Mexico State governor, the current governor, to push this through. And so we anticipate it will move forward in this year, but we really want to be a part of the process and push to make sure that we are setting standards much higher than the floor that EPA provides in regulation. And so with that, I think we can turn to the last slide just to summarize the places where we're engaging in this work alongside our really valuable partners in both Montana and in New Mexico. So first, there's this rulemaking in New Mexico that we anticipate will happen later this year. We plan to engage in that. And we want to make sure whoever is, whether it's the EPA or it's New Mexico, whoever is regulating these wells, we want to get whatever protections to communities that might be impacted into the regulations that guide these projects. The second piece is just continuing to track what's happening in the Four Corners with the projects that Rose was talking about earlier. And we're keeping an eye out constantly for places to engage in various processes that projects will have to go through. For example, environmental analyses where we can weigh in and say, hey, we see a potential harm here that needs to be analyzed before this project can move forward. And same for there's a pending Class 6 well application in New Mexico. So we're keeping an eye on that as well. And then finally, just those projects in the in the upper Rockies, we are keeping an eye out as well so that we can support our partners up there and engage in the environmental analyses for those projects as well. And with that, I think we're done. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and interest. I'll turn it back to Michelle.
There we go. Thank you so much, Morgan and Rose. Appreciate your presentation and all of your work surrounding all of this. Super informative. But we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if folks had any questions and they wanted to raise their hand or pop it into the chat, we can kind of go from there.
So I see a question in the chat, which I can go ahead and speak to. And the question is about CO2 when it's injected into saline aquifers. Can that become a risk of seeping into freshwater aquifers? And the answer is yes, that is always a risk, given the pressure that you have CO2 injected underground in. Although a lot of analyses are performed beforehand, there's a lot of modeling that happens before these projects that are allowed to move forward. Because Class 6 wells are so new and we don't have a lot of data on how the CO2 plumes move around underground, there is definitely the potential for unexpected movement that could endanger underground sources of drinking water. And once it moves into drinking water or underground water, you may be thinking, what's the big deal? It just creates carbonated underground water. But in fact, it starts a process by which heavy metals can leach into that water. So if a CO2 plume underground does contaminate an underground source of drinking water, we don't know how that would be remediated. I assume it would be incredibly costly if it could even be done. And one more note on that point is that the first Class 6 well in the country, the Illinois ADM project, has already experienced unexpected migration of the CO2 plume that was not projected in the modeling. So I think that just demonstrates how little we know at this point about what happens when you pump highly pressurized CO2 underground.
Thanks, Morgan. To circle back to the chat, there was a question from Bill, if you could just expand upon just whether or not you're in favor or against the tax credits for CCS and wanting to hear the pros and cons of each a little bit more.
I can speak to the tax credits at least, and I think sort of, and Morgan, correct me if I think as an organization, we don't necessarily take a stance on all CCS everywhere. There's different types of it that maybe what we focus on is on a project by project basis, where we hear from our community partners in different areas, or where we see in the technology and in the science that a proposed project is not going to be a real climate solution. Stuff like these retrofits of coal-fired power plants, for example, that's a type of CCS that we have been opposing and are prepared to continue to oppose, are tracking as well. That's the basis of our work. So we look at each project individually, we look at the facts, the science, and what community groups are saying. And based on that is kind of where we are drawing our positions right now on this stuff. And the proposed projects in New Mexico and in Montana that Morgan talked about are not meaningful climate solutions in any way, and are instead just vehicles to continue to develop fossil fuels. So it's the opposite of a climate solution. And so that's sort of the answer on that front where WELC is at. And in terms of the tax credits, I guess, I don't know, Morgan, we would be opposed to tax credits for fossil fuel related carbon capture and sequestration projects. They're required for, industry pretty much resoundingly says that they're required for these to be profitable. We don't necessarily want the increased development of fossil fuel projects to be profitable. especially under the guise of that they're getting tax breaks because it's a climate solution when the science doesn't bear that out. So I think we would be opposed to the tax credits. Morgan, does that sound right?
Yeah, I think we're opposed to subsidies for oil and gas, and I think that the way a lot of these tax credits are being used is to promote continued and expanded oil and gas development, and we are not supportive of that.
A few more questions in the chat. And
I can take
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Morgan.
Okay, thanks. There's a question in there about how primacy works on tribal lands. Is there a different process that's used for tribes? That is a really good question. So tribes can apply for primacy over these classes as well as also. And we have heard that Navajo Nation is, for example, and who is relevant in the Four Corners area, of course. They are planning to apply for primacy over Class 6 wells. I think that the process is slightly different in that there are different things that a tribe needs to show to gain primacy than what a state needs to show to gain primacy. And I could get back to you with the specifics, but I don't recall them offhand. I can also speak to, there's a question in the chat about what happens when a CCS what happens when CO2 that has been injected underground leaks to the atmosphere? I think this is a really, really important question because what we hear a lot from folks who work closely with industry is that carbon injection is a mature technology because it's been used for so long for enhanced oil recovery. But as I said earlier, that is different than Class 6 wells just due to volume and other considerations. And research that I've seen, studies that I've seen says that you have to have, and I'm hoping I'm getting the numbers here right, but ballpark, you need to have a leakage rate to the atmosphere of less than 1% over a span of 1,000 years or so for it to be more effective as a climate solution than just using renewables. And I know that we can't use renewables to power everything, but we can use them to power a lot of things like the grid. Um, and and from what we've seen, for example, in the environmental analysis for the Snowy River project, was that the projected leakage to the atmosphere that was included in that environmental analysis. I forget what it was, but it was around or over that threshold that we saw in the literature. So I think there's an open question. I mean, it's just modeling, it's projections, but there's an open question as to whether the CO2 will stay in the ground for long enough for it to be worthwhile as a climate solution.
Thanks, Morgan. I know we had a Pennsylvania specific question, but I'm not sure if that's a little too detailed. If either of you saw that one. And then, sorry, sifting through these.
I think as to whether carbon capture and sequestration is happening in Pennsylvania, there are organizations who work on these issues in Pennsylvania, and I would be happy to connect you, the person who put that comment in the chat. I would be happy to connect you with an organization working in Pennsylvania on these issues.
I had another message to me. Does artificial industrial CCS work at the scales required and for long-term storage? And I know sometimes these questions on the fly are a little difficult, so we can always circle back to folks and follow up on them as well.
I'll just say that it depends, which is a classic lawyer answer, but it depends on what process you're looking at, and it depends on, and there are kind of two questions that I hear in there. It's important to pick apart there's the capture piece and there's the injection piece. And then there's transportation, which we haven't even talked about today. But as far as capture goes, there are resources available. One partner who we really recommend for information on this stuff is IEFA, which is the Institute for Energy, and maybe Rose knows. We can put it in the chat. But IEFA is a really great partner with a lot of resources on this stuff. But what you'll find is that capture rates vary depending on the application. So for example, natural gas processing, which I talked about earlier, is a very mature technology because you can't sell fossil gas to markets unless you pull all the other gases out of it first or get it to a certain ratio. So you have to pull the CO2 out to be able to sell it. And they have never, thank you, Tom Solomon, who just put the link in the chat. And natural gas processing has never gotten to 100% emissions capture, right? And then you might want to look at a coal-fired power plant and what happens when you try to use CCS on a coal-fired power plant. Again, you're not going to get to 100%. All to say, it really depends on the process that you are asking about.
Another comment from Julie in the chat. There's a bit of chatter going on there, but the cost for just building industrial CCS facilities is enormous. I've seen costs of $4 to $5 billion each, not including ongoing yearly costs. Did this get ignored due to fossil fuel industry pressure?
I don't know if I can speak exactly to that or like particular circumstances. I'm not sure if the costs have been. It's a good, I mean, I think kind of fundamentally these plants that are intended to connect to fossil fuel sources, whether it's oil and gas or coal related sources, are really promoted by the fossil fuel industry, which we all know is like the most powerful industry on earth. So some of the federal funding for this stuff has been promoted by that industry, even though it was included in the climate packages. Whether or not there's ongoing problems with the calculations of whether or not CCS is good technology based on the energy drain that is required to operate them, whether or not that's a net energy savings at all, and the ongoing costs required to operate these facilities. So all I can say is that they are super expensive. We are opposing the mega facility that we've seen proposed in New Mexico, in part on that basis that it's not a good use of taxpayer dollars for something that's not a climate solution in the long run. And I think there remains sort of open scientific questions about whether or not the math works out on the energy required to operate these giant facilities versus any potential greenhouse gas savings. I don't know, Morgan, if you want to expand on that, but all I can say is I hear you.
Yeah, I think that really goes to the tax credits that Rose was talking about earlier too, just all the federal money getting pumped in. I can answer Tom Solomon's question. Thanks, Tom Solomon. He's with 350 New Mexico, and we're really grateful to partner with him. The New Mexico Energy and Natural Resources Department, MNERD secretary, who is a big proponent of CCS, she has been talking about CCS on natural gas processing plants in New Mexico, some of which are near the Four Corners. Tom, we're not exactly sure if like which natural gas processing facilities she's talking about, but that's something that we expect will be a part of this mega project. From what we've seen from some of the documents we've requested via the Freedom of Information Act, we know that a handful of carbon dioxide sources have been identified for the Class 6 well application that's pending in the Four Corners region, and we don't know what those sources of carbon dioxide are because they've been redacted from the documents. And so we're kind of left to guess We are confident that the Four Corners power plant, coal-fired power plant, is one of them. And as an aside, that coal-fired power plant is currently slated to shut down in 2031, is my understanding. And so if CCS were put on it, it would remain open far longer than it otherwise would. But in addition to the Four Corners power plant and Escalante, I think Rose mentioned, we also suspect that at least one of the natural gas processing facilities in that region will also supply CO2. Yeah, and feel free to jump in, Tom, if you have anything to add or additional questions.
Well, I had this meeting with Secretary Kenderdine, and she tried to convince me of the value of CCS, and I tried to convince her that it was a bunch of hooey. So we had an interesting back and forth. Her contention is that these natural gas processing plants, some of which are enormous sources of CO2, because they're just pulling the contaminant of CO2 off of natural gas so that they can sell it, as you stated. And if they're doing it anyway, her contention is, why not try to capture that carbon and sequester it? I have no idea if there is even technology to do that, or whether that has been attempted in a natural gas plant. And I'm just wondering whether you've looked into that in your research, just to see if what she's proposing is even physically possible.
Yeah, thanks. Super good question. So this actually feels really similar to the Snowy River project in Montana that we're seeing, which pulls its CO2 from the Chute Creek gas processing facility. So I understand the secretary's argument that the CO2 is being generated regardless, why not sequester it? And I think our concern here is very situational, as Rose said before, because first, the CO2, there's a pipeline that runs across the state of New Mexico to bring CO2 down to the Permian for enhanced oil recovery. So if a natural gas processing facility in the Four Corners is hooked into this bigger mega project, then it would also be connected to that pipeline, and the CO2 would be sold for more EOR. And maybe there's a valid argument that we should be doing that with captured CO2 instead of mined CO2. On the flip side, then you're getting an infrastructure build out to perpetuate that connection. And you're also, I had another counter argument thought, but I lost it. And then the second part of this puzzle too is where are the injection sites located? And the injection sites, as we've seen them, are pretty close to Farmington. So if you have CO2 that's getting pulled from these natural gas processing facilities and you're sending them, even if you're sending them primarily for long-term geologic storage, should that be happening underneath communities in the Farmington area, given the potential risks associated with transport and storage? We are concerned about that. And of course, our partners are concerned about that. So I think technologically, Tom, I'm pretty sure it is possible, since that's what Chute Creek does. But I think with the facts, the situational facts, we're not stoked about that idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. There's a question in the chat about CO2 the purity of streams of CO2, and that is a really good flag as well. CO2 can have a bunch of different impurities in it, and that impacts both safety during transport and then also safety during storage, because and I'm not a scientist here, but my understanding is that any impurities in the CO2 stream they can react in different ways with the pipeline or the well infrastructure. And so that's something that I think was in some of the conversations around the New Mexico bills in terms of getting protections in place that related to CO2 purity.
And if I could just add really quick, the soda drink companies thing is only hardly a joke. That is something that we've seen in New Mexico PowerPoints for these projects, that as another proposed use of the CO2 after the fact. So that's actually, you might consider running for the New Mexico State Legislature.
Absurd. I think that, yeah, great plug in there, Rose. But just reading the chat here. But to be conscious of everyone's time, and I'm sure Morgan and Rose have been, exhausted of a lot of questions and everything, so they're also happy to answer questions after the fact. I guess we can, I don't know, there's one more in here. If either of you have an answer to this last one, and then we'll do our little raffle and wrap up. But on what percentage of government-funded carbon sequestration solutions are aimed at nature-oriented solutions like large-scale restoration or wild habitats? If you have any input on that, and then we'll wrap up.
I will say, because the climate team's focus is largely on fossil fuels, that is something that we don't track. So unfortunately, unable to answer that question, but thank you for the question.
Thanks, Morgan, for that last one. And then, so we will be raffling off a stainless steel WELC cup today, and and the winner is Russ Ziegler. So Russ, I'm not sure, it doesn't look like, I don't think you're on the call right now, but I'll be following up with you to get your cup. And then with that, I think we'll wrap everything up. So just again, Morgan, Rose, you're awesome. Thank you for all that you do, and all these important projects that you're working on. And also just thank you everyone for showing up today. It really makes a big difference in our work. WELC is a nonprofit. We wouldn't be able to do the work without our supporters. So much gratitude just for everyone here today for taking the time to join us. I know everyone's busy and the world is a bit chaotic right now, but a lot of gratitude from our end for taking the time. So just thank you. And Rose and Morgan, if you had anything else to add, feel free to jump in.
No, just thanks everyone for showing up today. I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Well, everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and thanks again. Bye.